Hey folks, welcome to the Counter Clipping Show for January 24th, 2022. I'm gonna take some time for me to get used to saying 2022. So let's briefly talk about what's going to happen tonight. So we are drinking Glendronach 12. I got this a while ago and it's great. Like it a lot. This is a sherry aged cask. It's quite good. It was doing fine with no water, and I put a little bit of water into it. I don't think it really makes much difference in this case. It may open up the nose a little bit if you add water to it, as is typical. We are clipping the Little Land. This is a recent, but I think not the most recent entry in the CSS Company Scale System or Company Scale series from Compass Games and Adam Starkweather. And there's a bunch of fairly enticing looking stuff coming in that series. Although the next one is going to be Berlin 85 at the company scale, which should be massive, but I'm on the edge. I didn't buy Folded Gap either. So we might talk a little bit about that. Tonight's topic is, as you know, typically the topics are things that I think of during the week because I thought about them during the week, and that was the case this week. And we'll talk about the list of essential war games, which I actually went to post earlier today as a pinned comment on this video, and that didn't work. So we'll try and do it somewhere else. I'll still put it as a pinned comment in this video, but it's going to have to be after the stream. So check back is what I guess that means. So old school gaming, right? So I mean, I'm a person of kind of old-fashioned taste in a lot of ways, and this applies to war games, but it also applies to role-playing games, and we may talk a fair amount about RPGs in the old-school context tonight, because there's a very active old-school movement in RPGs, which if you're into RPGs, you may have heard of, and we'll see if we can talk about that. I am probably not much younger than you, Stigler, just so you know. So before we get to saying hello to everybody, I'd like to remind you to please like the video. Please do subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the links in the video description to the Patreon, the Ko-Fi, and the merch store. I did get the new webcam, but I did not get it set up over the weekend, which was my intention. So we're still on the old webcam today, which probably means tomorrow too, since I'm almost certainly not going to set it up tomorrow and potentially derail the stream with Dan tomorrow. So look for that next week, and we will be trying to make that upgrade for next week. It is sitting in a box right over here, right on top of another box that's the old Victory Games Pacific War, which I was noodling around with a little over the weekend, rather than setting up the new webcam. So let's say hello to Joe Faust from sunny, and by sunny I mean buried in snow, Akron, Ohio. It's snowing here like right now, and it has been snowing on and off, and mostly on for the last day and a half. So we got a fair amount of snow. We do not normally get buried here in central Ohio. They get more up in the Cleveland, Akron, Canton area. Dale Brady, hello from Michigan. So that's got to be worse than Ohio, I would think. Charles Latorra, Mike Anthony, F.S. Mura, Iggy Cricktal, Carl Crater from the Wargame Bootcamp, Brant from the Armchair Dragoons, Patrick from Patrick's Tactics and Tutorials, Husa Maldonado, Charles Latorra. Did I say you already, Charles? I totally did. Stephen Roberts, Stigler, Brian Foley, Paul O'Farrell, Strelnikov, Agray Day, Rick Cox, John Clark, K-Bar 54, Richard D. Fortuna, Manders, Jason W., Jeff Anderson, William Bird, Fast Hines, James Whitmer, Daniel Berger, Brett McCabe, Achilles, John Longshore is in the house, Greg Grant, Wade Moore, A. DiFilippo, Lind Pratt, also from Buried in Snow, Central Ohio, Jean-Sebastien Roy, Henry Sikorsky, Jim Jennings, Jeffrey Wesevich, this fucko is in the house. Tony from Tony's Board Life is here. Thomas Bandy, Marty Sample is here. Hissy Cat Studio from sunny San Diego, California. Oh, poor you. William Aarons, Matt Davidson, Joe Perez. I think I got Daniel Berger already. And it looks like that is it for now. So the first thing we're going to actually probably cover here tonight, I've got like one formation. So this is getting baggied because I don't believe I can get 7.5 counter sheets in 2 trays. And it's getting baggied by infantry regiment in this case. This is the Not entirely successful Soviet amphibious invasion on the Black Sea in 1943. I think it's 1943, around Novorossiysk. The Soviet naval forces are in this incredibly shocking hot pink. So, and generally speaking, while I have a lot of great things to say about CSS, it is really a colorblind person's total nightmare, to be honest, because it's like there's like literally two different shades of pink here that I don't know that if you're colorblind you'll be able to tell the difference. There's two different browns which are even closer, so it's if you're not colorblind, I'd actually like to do that as a show topic with Dan one of these days, but I need to find somebody that is either colorblind and can speak from experience, or at least knows more about it than neither me or Dan. Otherwise, it's just me talking again, and we have that every week. So let's talk about the big news of the week in Wargaming, which is the GMT update. So let's... Oh, is this misbehaving again? I guess that'll do. All right, so once again, if you want to read the whole thing, go to the GMT website and read the whole thing. And there's a whole bunch of interesting things here. Back box sneak peek. Apparently, it's such a great expansion that it's getting a box. Fall of Saigon. I do have this on order. We'll get to why in a minute. More GMT1 stuff. Hats that look okay. They still have counter trays as of several days ago when they posted this thing. Shout out to the GBACW team at a peek at Bill Burns' incredible AAR-4 Into the Woods. So check that out if you're into American Civil War or GBACW or Shiloh specifically. It looks really good. It's coming real soon. P500 editions. 4 new P500 editions, 2 of which are just reprints. Sovereign of Discord is another Fire in the Lake expansion. This will be the 3rd add-on for Fire in the Lake. The first of which was the Trung bot, which I don't have and I should get. It's a solitaire bot for Fire in the Lake. It's a different solitaire bot than comes with the game. We'll talk about Hollow Legions 2, at least briefly. If you really want to see more on Hollow Legions, the feature unboxing of the week on Thursday will be Hollow Legions. So there's a lot there. So Sovereign of Discord. So the Fall of Saigon expansion basically extends the war a couple years further than Fire in the Lake normally handles it, to the Fall of Saigon in 75. Sovereign of Discord extends the war earlier from what Fire in the Lake normally handles, back to 61. So with Sovereign of Discord, Fire in the Lake, and Fall of Saigon, you'll be able to handle the entire Vietnam War from 61 to 75, which sounds great. So I ordered that. The Hunters, Silent Victory, I've got those. I don't need those. I don't need more of those. And we have a mounted map plus a 3-inch box for Downfall. Now, the interesting thing is, I'm not on the hook for Downfall yet, but the interesting thing is here that they're offering it as the 3-inch box as part of the mounted map thing. Because almost certainly Downfall is not going to come with a 3-inch box, right? So if you have a mounted map, you're almost certainly not going to be able to fit all the pieces, all the board, all that stuff back in the box. So it is a new development that GMT is offering a 3-inch box along with the mounted map for Downfall, and I hope that follows. I hope they continue to do that, but they aren't doing that as recently as Salerno 43, which should be shipping imminently. So we're going to have pretty low temperatures, like in the single digits here, sometime in the next couple of days. Recent P500 editions, we've covered all this stuff. We don't need to cover it again. Here's more details on the 4 new P500 editions. New P500s on the horizon. New Wargames set during the 30 Years' War, no clue. Smaller, faster playing game for Volko's Levian campaign series. That could be one of any number of projects. There's a lot of development effort going into Levian campaign right now, with at least half a dozen additional Levian campaign games going that aren't on P500 yet, but I know about, and I'm not in the Discord or any of that where they're coordinating this stuff. Game number 1 in a new series from Rick Young, no idea. Political military game that came out of last year's Zenobia Awards competition. Some of those are pretty neat, so I'm interested to see what that looks like when it comes out, or at least when we get news. Iggy Kriegtall is colorblind, and Brian Foley is colorblind. So So yeah, that's like not a pretend problem, right? It's a legitimate problem, and there's different kinds of color blindness. I don't feel qualified to talk about it, right? Because I'm not colorblind. I have near whatever my other eye problems going on, which are substantial. I have near perfect color vision, so it's not that hard for me to tell this brown from this brown. But man, if somebody has any kind of color problem at all, they're going to have problems with these browns. Okay, canceled the War Room at Dice Tower West. Now, Dice Tower West is not canceled, at least as of today. I have Origins news, by the way, but the War Room is canceled. That doesn't mean there won't be people playing GMT stuff at the War Room at Dice Tower West, but like the official event, presumably the people who, I don't know, I don't want to speculate as to the reasons, but as an official thing on the docket at Dice Tower West, it appears to have been canceled. Origins announced today that attendees will be required to stay masked, which was the case last year, and unlike last year, they will be asked for proof of vaccination. So FYI, if you're planning on Origins, bear those factors in mind. If you have made the decision to not get vaccinated, I guess you're not going to Origins. So GMT East appears to be still happening. Spring 2022, weekend at the warehouse. What else do we got here? We've had low stock on this stuff from Vivictus for eons, and we are not going to talk further about the COVID situation at this time, because I don't want to get into that. Not there yet, P500 items. Okay, another last 100 yards volume, that's going to make its number. No Retreat Battles has been there for a while, but it's pretty close. It's going to make its number. Baltic Empires, another last 100 yards pack. Those will make their numbers. Red Winter Update Kit. I'm not sure how long that's been sitting around, actually. Mons 1914's been on there for a good 6 months or a year, but it will hit, and it's slowly gathering. It should hit its number. Grand Prix, I have no opinion on that. I don't pay attention to that, so I don't know how long it's been there. The Bell of Treason, that's the 38 Czechoslovakia crisis. That's been on P500 for a little bit, but that should make its number too. Infernal Machine is a relatively recent addition. It's you're building and then sending on a mission the Civil War submarine. It actually looks kind of neat. Hannibal's Revenge, to be honest, I forget exactly what that is. Bear Trap is the Soviet-Afghan War, and another update kit for one of the No Retreat games that I don't have. So, the news that we've been waiting for here. A GMT charge for the following games on January 3rd. All right, let me know if we are offline for any reason. So, I can vouch that GMT did in fact charge for these 7 items, 6 of which are games, on January 13th, and they plan to begin shipping in 1 to 2 weeks. That is looking like first week of February. So just so we know about where that is. If the eternity of history is any indicator, I will be the very last person to have their stuff shipped to them. So that just always seems to be the case. But I did order Barbarossa Army Group Center, Into the Woods, Pacific War, Salerno 43, and Vietnam 65 to 75. Plains Indian Wars, I didn't order. Hilariously, I added the weights to all this up. Bear in mind, there's 2 copies of Pacific War, 2 copies of Vietnam. So the whole order comes to 40 pounds if they ship it all together, which they should, because they charged me in one giant block instead, which is a hilarious weight in board games. So my mailman will be very displeased. All right, so what else do we have here? The stuff we know about that we just talked about. Also at the port and projected mid-February warehouse arrival, U.S. Civil War and the U.S. Civil War update kit. Again, that's excellent, highly recommended by me, but I have it already and I don't need it. And I even have the update kit already too. The last update kit that they did. At the printer, with no ship date yet, Almoravid, CDG Solar System, Churchill, Empire of the Sun, Fall of Saigon, Flashpoint South China Sea, and Red Storm Baltic Approaches. So I am on the hook for Almoravid, Fall of Saigon, and Red Storm Baltic Approaches. So Fall of Saigon and Baltic Approaches are just add-ons, so they're not going to I'm not going to get annihilated like I was on January 13th. But on the subject, of the Red Storm expansion. Something that showed up this week. Now, you can get these from the Game Crafter. These are aircraft cards for Red Storm, and they have them for Elusive Victory at least as well. And then the little ones are for SAMs, and then these are for aircraft. So you got a big deck and a little deck. The whole thing with shipping cost me roughly $28, I think. So since I will have everything else for Red Storm, and since it is the definitive non-dogfighting World War III and Central Europe thing, I grabbed this as well. My buddy, who is a big fan of the series locally here, had these at Origins, not at Origins, at Winterfest last year, and I was like, wow, these are really helpful. So we have those. Yeah, I don't know if the 10 pounds for Pacific War. Remember, man, it's 2 mounted maps. So, yeah, so they have it for downtown as well, as Husa mentions. So, Daniel Berger says you don't just have to play Pacific War. You can use it for curls to build your powerful biceps. So, so I will say that unless you want a tactical Vietnam game where there's a little more selection, that the at least at this point, if you want an operational level Vietnam game, the only thing in town is the Victory Games Vietnam, which this is essentially a straight reprint of with a substantial component upgrade. So that is with shipping, and it was about $10 or $11 for shipping. The decks of cards themselves are not that were not that much. I didn't feel like they were that much. I mean, I guess they were pricey, but for the amount of play value that they add, if I ever play Red Storm again out of my copy, which I do plan to, then I think that's worthwhile. Anyway, next up, going to the printer in February. I want to say both of these were going to the printer in February, back in December. Our Charioteer, which I have not ordered, and Great Battles with Julius Caesar Deluxe, which I have ordered and which I am very excited about. Next to get a print slot includes, and we're going to stop here, Banish the Snakes, CNC Ancients Expansion, number 5, second printing, Fields of Fire, The Bulge, Mr. President, that's been lurking in a state of near completion for a long time, as has the Musket and Pike Dual Pack, Norway 1940, a PQ-17 expansion. I am almost certainly going to order that. Excuse me, but I have not at this point. Paths of Glory new printing, and Twilight Struggle Red Sea, which I am absolutely had no intentions of buying whatsoever. So, and then in the art department, I'll point out, since Mr. Stigler himself is in the chat, that's I want to say something he is involved with. Battles for the Shenandoah, a Death Valley expansion. So it's going to add even more value to the already incredibly high value Death Valley box. And the Stalingrad 42 expansion. And Russian campaign, God, I don't know what's going on with that. So what did they link to here? Flying colors this month, so that's cool. Board for Banish the Snakes looks nice. Not really into the game, but the board looks nice. The mini game of Twilight Struggle Red Sea looks exactly what you would expect it to look like. Jed Kennedy, thanks for joining. Here's a Blenheim map for Banish All Their Fears. Here's some... Oh, these are interesting and very un-GMT-like French counters for that, so that's interesting. I'll be curious to learn more about... I haven't ordered that either, but I'd be curious to learn more about it. Now, there is... Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire did an interview with the folks behind Cross Bronx Expressway, and it's not just like, hey, we're building this road. It's like this urban management game. It actually sounds very interesting. I have not ordered it, but I'm thinking about it. And if I'm thinking about it, the chances of me ordering it are pretty good. We're not going to get into the reprint tracking. If you're interested in any of this stuff, go check out the GMT website. So, turn that off. Okay, I got to get my stream scenes straightened up. So, yeah, Marty, that's in line with the report, I think. If they start shipping it in a couple of weeks, which is what I expect. Like I said, I expect first, second week of January, I think, is when they're going to start shipping. That's, a guess informed by the date that they said. All right, so what else do we have? So we're still playing War in the Desert. I think we're up to June 1 of 43 now, I think. We're moving pretty quickly on that, and it is, now that we're moving as quickly as we are, I'm less frustrated with it. Let me put it that way. That said, I am, I'm on the record as sharing my opinion on Europa, a lot. So we're not going to belabor that anymore. We will be setting up Third Winter this coming week, as we prepare to finish up Blitzkrieg Legend. So that is very exciting, and Winterfest is only a couple of weeks away. So Cedar Creek is an interesting situation, and actually we talked about that too, and I think next time we hit GBACW, I think it's likely that Cedar Creek is the thing that we're going to play. So that is, it's on our list. I was noodling with Pacific War specifically because it's coming real soon, right? I should have it within a month, and we want to set it up and play it pretty fast. Now, on the where is the front line? In front of Tobruk, let me put it that way. Sort of between Tobruk and El Alamein is where we're still at. There were some really effective Axis attacks that basically wiped out entire Commonwealth corps, and the British just rebuilt everything in one turn. We have made progress on the OCS video front this week. Never as much as I would like, but we have made some progress. Give me a second. I'm going to turn a fan on once again. I'd meant to turn it on before the stream started, and I forgot, because there's a whole bunch of things. ID Jester, thanks for stopping by. There's a whole bunch of things that need to happen in the 10 minutes before the stream starts. So I lost track of it. So anyway, Brent, thanks for stopping by. Where is the front in French North? The front isn't in French North Africa at this point. It's still, we're still fighting over the Egyptian border. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that as well. There's supposed to be a Traveler Tuesday video for tomorrow, but that won't happen unless I get the video done tonight, which is probably unlikely. So we may not have Traveler Tuesday for tomorrow, but we will have the stream with Dan on Tuesday, right? So tomorrow. So there'll be a video. I put out a lot of videos in the last 2 weeks. So if I'm taking a little bit of a break, that's why. But we'll see what I can get done tomorrow. If I can get it filmed. Germans are not in Paris. We're still about, I think, not quite halfway through the game, and a major breakthrough has not yet occurred, but we're at the point where it could happen anytime in Blitzkrieg Legend. Yes, we will be at Buckeye Game Fest. In fact, email me about what you want to play at Buckeye Game Fest, and we'll have a chat about that. So, no, this is where the little land came from. Quality over quantity is a great idea. All right, so old school gaming. We talked a lot. We talked a lot last week about essential war games, a lot of which turned out to be classics, because one of the things that makes them essential is that time has given us some perspective on just how good they are, which is in part a function of, hey, this game's 50 years old and we're still playing it. And it's also Jeff Beeler, believe it or not, a new edition of On Guard is actually available now. You can get it on Amazon. It may be print on demand. I'm not sure. I actually have. I think the only RPG that GDW ever did that I never did own was On Guard, if one defines On Guard as an RPG, and I'm not 100% convinced that you should, based on what I understand of it. So, one of the things. So, as a war gamer, okay, now there's a lot of like newfangled, mechanics and stuff like that, and defining newfangled is kind of a semantic point. Some people will say CDGs are newfangled, even though they were introduced by Avalon Hill, right, which is a long time ago at this point. Michael R., you blame me for talking you into buying ASL. I'd love to play more ASL, but it just hasn't happened. I am incredibly trying incredibly hard to focus my attention, both in terms of war games and RPGs, just because I want to. Honestly, I want to spend less friggin' money. Mongoose is not making that easy for me, considering that one of the RPGs that I absolutely positively will never give up is Traveller, and they're putting out a lot of stuff for it. And in fact, all this showed up today, so there's that. So I got to figure out where it's going here, even though I made a Traveller spot on the shelf just for Mongoose Traveller 2nd Edition. There's not enough room for this stuff, unless I displace Goss, which I am disinclined to do. So so as far as wargaming goes, I'm pretty much a hex encounter person. I certainly do CDGs from time to time, and my opinion of certain CDGs is really, really high. But I'm more or less a hex encounter person. I like hex encounter, and I really have a preference for straight hex encounter, no cards or any of that stuff. So if you have the High Guard book and the previous core book, then you don't really need the update. There's really nothing new in there, except that it puts starship construction into the core rules again. Now, I don't know what the Amazon situation is, but I got it direct from Mongoose a couple of weeks ago. So there's that. The Deep Knit Revelation box will not fit on that shelf, unfortunately. I've got a lot of. I really do have a lot of Traveller stuff. If I emptied one of these bookcases, and bear in mind, how high are you seeing? You're seeing all 5 shelves of those bookcases. I would more than fill one with Traveller stuff between. Old GDW stuff, 4th edition, GURPS Traveller, all the different Travelers. The only Traveller I never owned was Traveller Hero, which nobody else bought either, so I don't feel bad. So that's not even all the current edition stuff that I have, and I don't have all this stuff. So, Ancient Conquest. That sounds intriguing. I've seen that. I don't really know a lot about it, though. Classic Traveller books. Agroshim, thanks for stopping by. I would imagine that those things are hard to find. On the other hand, I'm aware that there have been minimally Spanish and German editions of Traveller. I could tell you, I personally own a Spanish edition of Traveller. It's a beautiful book by Diseños Orbitales. And there was a German edition too, but I don't have any of those. There are other games I'm interested in, but a lot of it I'm just, I'm content to pick PDFs up. Now, one of those things is actually something I wanted to do videos on for a while, and that's Rollmaster. And I have recently started to lay the groundwork for some flip-through-esque videos on Rollmaster. Rollmaster Classic in this case, which is pretty much equivalent to Rollmaster 2nd Edition. I have Fifth Frontier War and Invasion Earth, and what do we mean by both editions of Imperium? Because there's a Conflict Games edition of Imperium, which is the original printing, like pre-GDW, but then there's the flat box version, and then the bookshelf box, the 1-inch bookshelf box version, and I have both of those. In addition, I have Imperium Next Millennium from Avalanche Press, and it is one of the very few things I have from Avalanche Press. I think I have 2 things from them. The other is Red Russia, which is kind of like Russian Civil War, but card-driven and using the mechanics from Risk. At some point, we did the Traveler live stream, so I don't want to just talk about Traveler, but one of the things that... So let's do some RPG contextualizing here. And try and figure out what exactly it is that we mean by old school, because I mean something different by it than you'll encounter a lot in just floating around looking at old school RPG stuff. So, D&D comes out in the little white box, right? Originally it was a brown box, but the white box was in print for a lot longer, right? And that's what we call OD&D, or original D&D right now. And so if you are like, how to play D&D, you could take those books and figure out how to play according to those rules. It wouldn't be that difficult. But if you didn't know how to play D&D, and nobody did back in 1974 unless you were playing with Gary, then you had a hell of a time figuring that out. Ken St. Andre famously looked through those and was like, what the hell is this? I have no idea how to interpret any of this, and ended up doing his own game. So it was recognized relative, and there were some expansions for that, Greyhawk, Blackmoor, and Eldritch Wizardry, but it was recognized relatively early on that there needed to be a product that actually explained how to play the friggin' thing to you. So they got J. Eric Holmes, Dr. J. Eric Holmes, who was a professor or something. I forget what his exact pedigree was. Even the white boxes can be worth a decent amount of money right now, but they were kept in print till the mid to late 80s, so don't assume that, right? There's a lot of printings. So, and that set, I didn't prepare pictures of these. That set is what's today called Holmes Basic. All right. But Holmes Basic, which I did own at one point, is a bit of a mess as well. And it doesn't give you the entire game. It gives you levels 1 through 3. And so, right around the late 70s, right around the time that Holmes Basic was coming out, Gary undertook the Advanced D&D project, right, which kind of codified, greatly expanded, in many cases using material that had appeared either in Dragon or in Greyhawk or Blackmoor or Eldritch Wizardry or in various other places, to expand and elaborate upon the game and explain everything a whole lot better. The first of those books was, and there's no hard line between OD&D and Holmes Basic and AD&D at this point. That line sort of crystallizes once the DMG comes out. But at this point, there's nobody that's thinking these are different game systems, right? First book to come out is the Monster Manual. Second book is the Player's Handbook. And the third book is the Dungeon Master's Guide. Now, these, of course, are the originals. And I still have a set of the old ones. I'm missing something. I think I'm missing a Yellow Spine Monster Manual or something like that. I forget. But I've got copies of all of those still. And I won't get rid of them again. But they're not my original copies. The only RPG that I still have back from, the days of 1982 or 83 or whatever it was, that where the ones I have are still my original copies is Traveler. So AD&D First Edition, as it came to be called later on, spawned a huge product line and stayed around for a long time. And I did have the original Deities and Demigods, and I got rid of it at some point stupidly. Shouldn't have done that. It's not as rare as people think, but it is highly collectible. At some point, I'd like to get it back, but I'm also not willing to pay $500 for it. That settled Agroshim. That settled out of court, actually. So if you're talking about the Arnson lawsuit, that settled out of court. So the courts did not actually rule on that. But they basically sort of bought Arneson off, and then Wizards of the Coast came in later on and kind of made it right with both of them. And remember, Gygax was later to be boned out of the whole company. So second edition AD&D comes out right around the time I graduated high school. And I remember that because I was paying pretty close attention to it at the time. And at the time, it seemed like a big to me, right? And remember, I'm like 17, right? So I'm basically a dumbass. Mike Anthony says when they heard that the Player's Handbook was over a year away, they put D&D on hold and made their own RPG that was a hybrid of D&D and Empire of the Petal Throne. That sounds like it might be interesting. I think I might have loaned my D&Ds. I know my original Fiend Folio got lent out and never got returned. I can tell you that. So at the time, D&D second edition felt like a big change from first edition, right? In retrospect, it really wasn't at all, right? It's really the same game. There are some relatively mild changes that they made. They took out some of the more controversial monsters, which was a fool's errand. Let's call it what it is, because it didn't satiate those people that were going to complain about that anyway. That wasn't the problem. Meaning they took out the assassin, the demons, and the devils. They also changed the way the combat with a 2-hit roll worked from a table-based mechanism to the THACO mechanism, where you didn't need the table anymore. You just needed addition and subtraction. And I remember liking the tables better, but in retrospect, THACO's probably the better mechanic. And in every other way, other than taking out assassins, demons, and devils, all of which later came back, by the way, second edition is really just an extra round of polish on first edition. It's the same game. It's exactly the same game. So I had the original Stormbringer from Chaosium too, and really didn't know what to make of it at the time. So Doug, they were not in the original monster collection though. They did bring them back as Betsu and Tanari or whatever they were called before too much longer, but they were not in that original 3-book. So it was a Player's Handbook, a Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monstrous Compendium, which was an attempt to do the monster book as a loose leaf format, which swiftly became a complete nightmare. And I think the Demons and Devils came back with the Outer Planes Appendix, which was the book with the infamous vagina cover. So there's that. So in any event, right, I was online relatively early, right, on like Cleveland Freenet and places like that where you could get internet access before a lot of people had internet access. And that gave you access to things like the Usenet and things like that. And I was really active on Usenet for several years and was very well known for really hating AD&D second edition. And again, in retrospect, I have cooled on it considerably. It is a perfectly workable iteration of the AD&D idea. Now, at the time, right, I started playing D&D with Moldvay Basic in like 1981. And Yeah, that's that, and that was the problem. Is they wanted to turn it into a subscription, and it turned into a giant friggin' mess. Um, yeah, so THACO is basically a number that you subtract the armor class from to get the number that you need to roll on a d20. Is basically how it works, and then each depending on your class, um, you'd have a progression where you get +1 to THACO every 2 levels or 1 level or whatever it was, depending on what your class was. Armor class 0 went from heavily armored, so that's what we call descending armor class, where lower armor classes are better. That changes in D&D 3rd edition, which I'm going to get to. Okay, so TSR at this point, sometime not long before, well, I don't know about the exact timing, but before 2nd edition came out, TSR had pushed out Gary Gygax. Lorraine Williams had taken the company over. Infamous in her disdain for games and gamers and everybody involved in the hobby. Swiftly, over the course of a couple of years, ran the company into complete insolvency. Whereupon it was either a White Knight, which turned out to be Wizards of the Coast. And you can go read about Ryan Dancy's experience kind of coordinating this process. It's a fascinating read. The situation was such that either D&D was going to be tied up in courts for probably a decade, and thereafter was probably going to go away. Or somebody with a big pile of money had to come in and save it and pay off all the creditors in the course of saving it so that they could get a clear title to it. That somebody flush with Magic the Gathering cash was Peter Atkinson and Wizards of the Coast. So with, and in an effort that was led by Ryan Dancy, okay, who later came up with the whole OGL thing. So they decided, let's actually do market research and work on a new edition. And their new edition was D&D they dropped advanced. So there's no longer at this point a distinction between regular D&D and advanced D&D. Mo from Mo's Game Table is here. Thanks for stopping by. I didn't like the Marvel Superheroes game at the time, and that's another one of those I was not sufficiently experienced to appreciate it at the time, because it's really a brilliant system. The open game license was Ryan Dancy's brainchild, okay, and it is the legacy of 3rd edition for good or ill. So after a couple of years, Wizards of the Coast puts out 3rd edition. Now they brought other people in to work on it, people who were not D&D people. They brought Jonathan Tweet in, whose primary credit prior to that had been Ars Magica. They brought Monty Cook in, whose big design cred prior to that had been with doing stuff for Rollmaster. And indeed, you can see some ideas from both Ars Magica and Rollmaster. Not much from Ars Magica, but there's a little bit with like the Wizard Familiars and stuff. And Rollmaster, definitely, where you're buying the skill ranks, it's 100% straight out of Rollmaster. However, what this resulted in was a game that was quite different in a lot of ways from previous editions. I don't want to overstate the lack of backward compatibility, but you couldn't just drop in like 2nd edition monsters into your 3rd edition game. You had to actually do conversions. Whereas with any of the previous games, basic, Holmes basic, whatever, you could just, there's a monster from this, expert module, that I could throw that in, no problem. Maybe you'd have to you'd have to like hand wave some more hit points or something like that, but otherwise it was totally fine. 3rd edition was different. It changes the mechanical underpinnings. It gave D&D an explicit core mechanic. I think Monty Cook did do some work with Planescape too. That would have been for second edition. But he also did stuff for Iron Crown. TSR had gotten themselves embroiled in a number of lawsuits over the years. Interestingly, they chose not to sue Wizards of the Coast for including D&D stats in the Primal Order, where Palladium Books did sue them because somebody doesn't know what he is doing. D&D 3 is the D20 system. Now, there's later going to be a D&D 3.5, which is D&D 3 with reformatted books and a couple of important but not big mechanical changes, right? They changed a few things about how the Ranger worked, and there's a few other things in there that are differences between 3 and 3.5. But again, it's like AD&D 1 and AD&D 2. They're the same game. But D&D 3 was really successful. It brought a lot of people who had been dissatisfied, regardless. And there absolutely were some people who were like AD&D players that never wanted to move on from whatever version of AD&D they were playing. Right. This is a completely fair. How many monsters were created under the influence? A great deal of them. Doug says that WotC was an advertiser. Primal Order lived on the back cover of Games Quarterly. Yeah, I loved the Primal Order. I thought it was a great product, actually. Well, pretty much they got exactly the same boning that SPI got, to be honest. William Aaron says he's limited his purchases to GMT and Worthington. Those are all, that's, good companies. I've got, trying to see the original comment. Hard to catch up. So, as somebody that was, I played AD&D 2nd Edition occasionally, right? One year I ran it at, because, it's the same game as 1st Edition pretty much, and I could run it pretty comfortably. I ran it at Gen Con just so I could get into Gen Con for free, because it was that kind of year. Lovecraft was actually crazy, though. Yeah, Champions is neat. Champions is one of my early RPG influences as well. So 3rd edition is very different from previous editions, right? And other than one Birthright campaign that I played in, which ran for quite a while, ran for about a year and a half, and which was tremendously enjoyable, not because of the system, but because it was Birthright, which I really liked as a setting, and the whole domain management thing, because, hey, a wargamer, go figure. And maybe we'll talk about that at a later time. Charles Stross, sci-fi author and horror author, I suppose, was responsible for the creation of a bunch of the monsters in the Fiend Folio, including the Githyanki. So a lot of people sort of rejected 3rd edition because there's a big gap there between AD&D 2 and D&D 3. There's a big gap there. They're very different systems. They do very different things. They have different scopes. And while a lot of the bits and bobs are the same on the surface, the mechanical underpinnings are pretty different. However, along with 3rd edition came the open game license, which basically said, aside from these specific things like these monsters and setting specific stuff like the Forgotten Realms and whatever, and you put this like open game license agreement in your product, and you can do D&D stuff too. And this sort of democratized D&D, right? It turned D&D from, okay, D&D is this thing from this publisher, and to play it, you buy these boxes or these books or whatever. It opened that up completely. There were then a huge array of other publishers that adapted older products to that D20 mechanism, or created new products using that D20 mechanism. This market got really, really bloated, but and eventually it crashed. But there are some things that have survived. One of those things being mutants and masterminds. And another of which is the chirping is the clipper. So this is because these are 5/8 inch counters. I'm using the 2.5. This is the one that was confiscated by the TSA, by the way. So that if it's just a little chirpy, I'm lucky. I did test it when I got it back, but I haven't oiled it since I got it back, which I clearly should have done. So, Open Game License creates this huge boom in D20 product. And this is where some companies that are still around got their start. Mongoose Publishing is one of them. They did a line of D&D, tack-on books that were like, I forget exactly what they were called. And frankly, they were of pretty dire quality. But they are one of the few companies. Green Ronin is another. That are still around, having taken off in that D20 boom. There was a Traveler 20 too, a D20 version of Traveler. It was interesting. Page 121 just did a video on it, actually. I never really figured out how to make characters in it. I appreciated what they were trying to do, which was to kind of fit the sort of Traveler random character generation into a D&D format. I don't think it fully worked. But it was a neat effort, I suppose. Avalanche Press did a ton of D20 books with lurid, cheesecakey covers, no less. So we'll get to Pathfinder, too. So, this Open Game License, which endures throughout the entire 3 and 3.5 era, is tremendously fertile for a bunch of different companies, right? One of those companies is Paizo Publishing, which licenses the rights to do the D&D magazines, which at the time were Dragon Magazine and Dungeon Magazine from Wizards of the Coast. And they produce those and publish those magazines in physical magazines for several years, and they do a really nice job of it. So eventually, Wizards of the Coast, under, which by this time has changed leadership several times, right? Peter Atkinson was no longer with them at that point. He had taken off and had actually bought Gen Con from them, which they got with TSR. And that's what Peter does now, is basically runs Gen Con, or owns the company that runs Gen Con. There was a D20 Call of Cthulhu. There was a D20, I literally can't list them all, right? There was a D20 Wheel of Time RPG. There was a D20 Star Wars, which we actually played and which wasn't that bad. But eventually Wizards of the Coast, under new leadership, decided that they were going to do another new edition. And I'm not sure I can tell you who the creative head was. The creative head of the third edition was Monty Cook, I think. Or maybe that was 3.5. And Jonathan Tweet was third. I could be mistaken about that. Doug will correct me if I am. I forget who ran the creative direction for fourth edition. But for all the people that never adopted third edition or 3.5, I feel like it brought an equal or greater number of people back to D&D. It made D&D relevant for them again. That was my personal experience with third edition. There were some D20 Harn products, and I actually have them. Wasn't Traveler D20 called? Yes, it was called. Well, shorthand, it was just called Traveler 20. I don't have the book on this shelf. It's on the shelf downstairs. But I do have, I think, 3 products, physical products, that were put out for T20. One of which is Gateway to Destiny, which is actually a really good book. Which is a, huge 4-sector tome. So, Wizards of the Coast never supported one of the neat things that happened in the second edition era was really fertile for things like settings and stuff like that. They did a lot of interesting settings, and they did some interesting things with those settings. Third edition era was less fertile from Wizards of the Coast themselves, but other companies picked up a lot of that slack. So the fourth edition, not everybody, I suppose, but a lot of the people, or an equal number of people, or a greater number of people, that came back to D&D because third edition was a system that seemed to address the mechanical deficiencies of previous editions, were chased away by fourth edition, which is, again, a complete shift. It's actually a much bigger shift. So remember, we talked about the gap between first and second edition AD&D is very narrow, right? There's not much there that says you can't just take this first edition stuff and use it in second edition or vice versa. Not a big problem. There's a significantly wider gap between second edition AD&D and third edition, but you could still say, okay, so I want to adapt this module. That pretty much means this first edition module, I pretty much have to refigure some of the monsters and that kind of thing. You'd have to put work into it, but you could do it. Fourth edition is completely different and uses a completely alien method of encounter design that basically invalidates every previous adventure. So that you couldn't just adapt the encounters. You'd have to redesign not just redesign the monsters, but redesign the encounters to be different, right? You're fighting the two vampires in Descent into the Depths of the Earth that you encounter at some point. Well, you can't just have the party fight two vampires. It would be a dull as ditchwater encounter in fourth edition, because fourth edition is essentially a board game. So you'd have to give them a bunch of minions and a bunch of weird powers and stuff like that to make that an effective encounter in fourth edition. And I'm oversimplifying to some extent, and I realize that. But the structure of encounter design in fourth edition is radically different from the structure of encounter design in any other edition of D&D, and therefore creates huge compatibility gaps between it and any other edition of D&D. In addition to that, you can absolutely play 4th edition D&D and have it be a completely satisfying D&D experience. But if you do, then congratulations, you have successfully put it in there, because it is not built in the case of 4th edition. There's some mechanically, it's very novel. I think it actually mechanically works quite well, but it's extremely mechanistic. It's like everything is a power, and it fits into this category, and it's this type of mechanic, and each class has their own sort of deck of powers that they have. It feels like it was criticized for feeling like an MMORPG, and I don't actually think that that's true, but there are some of those elements that are brought into it explicitly, like the tank, healer, DPS, Holy Trinity, that are brought into D&D explicitly with 4th edition. Let's face it, that is a thing that was always the case, but 4th edition made it very explicit. But it felt like a board game. I have half written a friggin' dissertation on D&D, actually, somewhere on a hard drive. So, 4th edition, and they tried to do a kind of a partial reset of 4th edition some part of the way through the product line's lifetime, and it did not succeed in resuscitating it. In addition, it was like there was this splat book escalation thing where you had to have all the splat books to really make the most effective character, and it was a lot of people hated it. Okay, and then we get to 5th edition, which again sort of resets the clock back from 4th edition. And people who complain about 4th edition, I kind of feel like, or 5th edition, sorry, kind of feel like they maybe didn't pay much attention during the 3rd and 4th edition eras. Because 5th edition, it is tuned very differently from AD&D 1st and 2nd edition, but it mechanically is closer to those than it is to D20 and certainly to 4th edition. But the power level tuning is quite different, such that it's considerably harder to kill characters. I don't want to say it's harder to kill characters. It is harder for player characters to get killed, because the game master should not be actively trying to kill characters. If that's something that the game master is trying to do, then they're a bad game master. So, a lot of folks had this sort of negative reaction to these newfangled versions of D&D, right? Whether that was 5th edition or 4th edition or 3.5 or 3. One of those groups was Paizo Publishing, right? Who was a publisher, you know, to some degree, like the most prominent, because they were publishing Dragon and Dungeon, prominent publisher of 3.5 and 3rd edition material, who was then left kind of out in the lurch when the time came to do 4th edition, because the OGL was much more restrictive under 4th edition, and it was not clear to them that they would still be able to continue publishing stuff. So they said, well, hell, we've got the open game license. We're just going to completely rebuild the game on the skeleton of the open game license, call it something different, and off we go to the races. And that turned into Pathfinder. And by some accounts, and at least in some markets, in the 4th edition era, Pathfinder was outselling D&D. And I can tell you that certainly, if you know the number of people playing it at organized play at say Origins was definitely higher. So I'll be honest with you, I'm not really paying much attention to what D&D 5th edition is doing right now, okay? I know they're being very reactive to people complaining about various things. I'm not keeping up with that. I cannot speak to that, okay? And at the end of the day, it doesn't much matter what they do, because the open game license democratized D&D, and we're slowly winding our way to the end of that story, okay, or the middle of that story, as the case may be. So, alongside Pathfinder, however, some other folks, and I want to say that the first of these was Osric, but I could be wrong about the chronology. It also depends on whether we count Castles and Crusades, which a lot of old OSR people don't want to count Castles and Crusades, and I think that's vastly unfair. It was realized that one could take the open game license and basically say, okay, we have this open game license, we have this D20 mechanic, right? But what we can do is take that D20 mechanic, strip it down a ton, and rebuild an older version of D&D, or something that looks a lot like an older version of D&D. 13th Age I've actually played, and it's pretty good. Pathfinder Organized Play benefits Pathfinder a lot, and it's very organized play. Let me put it that way. So alongside something like Castles and Crusades, which is the earliest one that I'm aware of, and again, I could be wrong about the exact terminology. There is no OGL equivalent license in Wargames. Nobody in Wargaming is doing this. And that's a great question that I think we are going... Matt Taylor, thanks for stopping by. And I think we're going to have to circle back to that in another time. But yeah, I guess we can get started on the hot pink guys. So... very small. That is actually a battalion, not a regiment. Anyway, so Castles and Crusades was basically an attempt to, and this is still around. Castles and Crusades still exists. So one of the early clubs that D&D evolved out of was the Castles and Crusades Society, or one of the early clubs that was started in response to D&D or Fantasy Miniatures Gaming or whatever. And Castles and Crusades is named after that. All right. So what it is basically say, okay, so let's ditch all these feats and all this super skills and all this really structured stuff, and let's take this D20 mechanic and distill it to a paragraph and say, okay, so you've got, depending on your class, you'll have a favored characteristic that you're better at making rolls at. And then you just have rolls under your characteristic. And that's the whole mechanic, right? Except for combat, which has its own mechanic, which we'll go ahead and restructure according to something that looks a little more similar to an older edition of D&D. So what you ended up with was this, because they have to have, the way the counters are set up, Stigler, they have to have a different base color for each, in this case, division. And there's like 6 Soviet divisions here, so you gotta, eventually you get to pink. There's like 2 browns, 2 pinks, there's a dark red, there's 3 browns, 2 pinks, and a dark red. So that's an interesting topic, and nobody in Wargaming has done that. Now, on the other hand, while you can patent game mechanics, no, I don't want to say nobody has done so. TSR tried to, but they did not succeed. It's really hard to do that. If you have like a different expression of the same game mechanic, it's hard. You could, again, consult an IP attorney if you want to know about this. So what Doug says is essentially correct. If you plan to do that, however, consult an IP attorney. No, this is pink. This is flamin' pink. Dave Heinsu. So Agray Day says DD2 was Zeb Cook, which is correct. Monty Cook, Jonathan Tweet, and Skip Williams was the guy I forgot. Did D&D 3 at least. And Dave Heinsu was D&D 4. And I don't know who was D&D 5. Was it crap. What's the guy's name? That's still with Wizards of the Coast, but now he's running Magic the Gathering. Mike Mirrells, I think, is the guy for 5th edition. So, Flamingo. That is totally an accurate color name for this pink. So, Drew Detterer, Black Sea pink counters. Yes, that's exactly right. Oh dear. It's a family show. It's really not. But I do try to keep the profanities relatively minimal in this particular show. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit. So, following on the heels of Castles and Crusades, which was not an attempt to emulate some specific older version of D&D. It was just an attempt to use the D20 toolkit, the SRD, the System Reference Document, to build something that looked and played closer to an older version of D&D, in a general sense, right? It wasn't emulative of a specific old version of D&D. Now, Osric comes along, and Osric is explicitly, it does exactly the same thing that Castles and Crusades does. It takes that System Resource Document, or System Reference Document, or whatever it is, and attempts to rebuild a specific older edition of D&D. In this case, it's kind of a hybrid 1st and 2nd edition. And Osric takes off. Osric takes off big time, and the next thing you know, people are doing exactly the same things with other different old versions of D&D. Swords and Wizardry, and what are the Essentials? There's Old School Essentials too, which is a newer one, which is really well presented. Swords and Wizardry is the one I can think of. That was a recreation of White Box D&D, as I recall. I don't find that appealing at all, to go back to White Box D&D. I even have reservations about going back to BECMI D&D, which is the old basic Expert Companion, Master, and Immortal set, the Tom Mold. I started with the Mold Vase sets, but Mensner did the revised versions of those sets, including the Companion, Master, and Immortal set. The Immortal set was a bit of a mess, but I will call it Rules Cyclopedia D&D, right? And my big hesitation there is that the conflation of race and class. I don't like that. I moved to AD&D as quickly as I could, specifically because I wanted to be able to make an elven wizard or an elven warrior or whatever I wanted. That gave me more control over the kind of player the kind of character I was going to play. So I was all about race and class as separate things. And let's face it, it will be. I know, John, there'll probably be about 30 people there. Labyrinth Lord is another one. And there's some good stuff for Labyrinth Lord, and there's some good stuff for Swords and Wizardry as well. This eventually turned into, okay, now let's like recreate old D&D, but let's add our own things into it. And we got things like Lamentations of the Flame Princess, and which really is just old D&D with a better system for summoning, and some of the spells are different. And there's some other ones that and it's impossible to keep track of them. There's ones that came out years ago. There's ones that came out recently, and there was a big blogging scene that revolved around the so-called Old School Renaissance or Old School Revival or OSR, that has embraced the aesthetics of older edition play. I think a lot of hay gets made out of the mechanical differences. I think Legend of the Flame, I guess. I'm not a fan of Lamentations of the Flame Princess. I do like the summoning rule. That's cool. But other than that, I don't see much to recommend it. The evolution of D&D. Remember, there's an entire hobby evolving around D&D at this same time, right? So, you know, it's more complicated than D&D. And indeed, that is one of my pet peeves with the OSR, is its myopia in refusing to acknowledge that other games that than D&D existed in the old school. And specifically, I'm talking about Traveler and RuneQuest, but also Chivalry and Sorcery and Bunnies and Burrows. And, you know, if you start, and those are all, this is all 70s, right? If you start getting into the 80s, then it really starts to blow up into games like Rollmaster and Cabal and all kinds of other things. So, not that Cabal was good, but, you know, still. So I guess where I'm going with this is there, you know, there was a reaction against the changes that had taken place in D&D. Tunnels and Trolls dates from the 70s as well. Dragon Quest, I think, was 81. And Dragon Quest is actually, so that's the SP, there's TSR, of course, bought, you know, or acquired SPI's assets, including the name Dragon Quest. And they later released a game called Dragon Quest that was not the same Dragon Quest. But SPI's fantasy RPG Dragon Quest is actually a pretty neat game in a lot of ways. Palladium's another one. Empire of the Petal Throne was also super, super, super early. Isgarth was also super, super early. Not that early, but Empire of the Petal Throne came out in 75. As did Tunnels and Trolls. Well, I think we're going to start tying everything. Stigler, I think we're going to start tying things together now. I think I've said, I mean, I kind of had to provide that background, although there's some folks in the chat that I have enabled super chats, by the way. I don't know what that actually looks like. Let me pull that up. And that was based on a suggestion from...
We do not actually know how...
Poop. That was based on a suggestion from the chat from a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, okay. There's a way to support the chat, support the channel right at the bottom of the chat where you're typing stuff in. You can create a super sticker or super chat. So bear that in mind. And I have no idea how any of that works. So I just turned it on. Perfidious Albion, I want to say you are thinking of Dragon's Lair. That was the game I believe you are thinking of. I mean, there's not that much of a difference between the way people were playing D&D back in the 70s and Magic Realm. That's absolutely true. And because D&D had evolved from Wargames, right, a lot of the players were wargamers, and they tended to treat it like a war game. And a lot of the folks coming to D&D now don't see it that way. So to finish off the like D&D history discussion, we have to talk about Critical Role and assorted phenomenon, okay? So what Critical Role is, if you haven't watched it, and I'll be honest, there's a lot of people doing like live play of RPGs on the internet, on YouTube or on Twitch, and I find it absolutely unwatchable. I feel bad because folks are putting effort into those productions. Even the really good ones I find absolutely unwatchable. And Critical Role is one of them. So what Critical Role is this dude, Matt Mercer, says, hey, I'm playing D&D with my buddies anyway, who are all also professional. Oh, Mike Anthony, thank you very much. Who are also professional voice actors and who work a lot in video games specifically. And we're going to broadcast our game. And it took off, like huge took off, as in like they are now like a multi-million-dollar company. And with that, other people started streaming their D&D games, and 5th edition D&D, even though they're officially working on a 6th edition now, which I don't know what that's going to look like. And as of this moment, I'm cordially disinterested in it. Has been super, super, super popular. It's doing extremely well for Wizards of the Coast. Wizards of the Coast makes more money than, and D&D is just part of this, right? I mean, they got Magic and Pokemon too, but D&D, is the Wizards of the Coast makes more money than Hasbro makes on friggin' toys now. Okay, so they're big, and the former CEO of Wizards of the Coast under Hasbro has just been, and I forget the person's name, has just been, please, bidding war, thank you, has just been promoted to CEO of Hasbro. So whatever's going on at Wizards of the Coast is very, very forefront in the minds of the people running Hasbro. I'm not criticizing anybody that watches that. I just, as somebody that plays RPGs, I can't get into it because there are characters that I'm not playing, right? So, and I think it's that simple. There may be exceptions that I haven't encountered. And even like the Critical Role people are doing it as well as anybody. They're professional voice actors anyway. They have a staff with multiple cameras and all, on a stage and props and stuff. And I still can't watch it. It'll put me to sleep every time. Now, on the other hand, if I'm having trouble sleeping, it's wonderful. So, and not everybody is as good at it as Critical Role. But the point is that due in part to Critical Role and the phenomenon of people streaming this stuff, which is something that became more prominent thanks to Agri Day, which Star Trek RPG are you talking about? Because the FASA Star Trek RPG did not come out until a few years later. Traveler came out in 1977. If you're talking about that thing that Luzaki did, that was, in my opinion, not an RPG. And also unlicensed. Yeah, and that's another thing, is they'll have hundreds of people watching them play on Twitch, so. William Aarons, thank you so much. What percentage of my time in the hobby is taken up by RPGs and what percentage by traditional war games? I'll be honest with you, like 95% war games. I mean, we have, after all, done 58 counterclipping shows, and while we've mentioned RPGs, there's only been one show that was dedicated to an RPG topic, and we happen to be talking about that more tonight. So, yes, if you do Super Chats, you can get your question highlighted, and I will absolutely see it. Because it's like, wah, in my face. Unlike a lot, it's really easy, and I apologize to those people who watch, every week, and whose questions I miss just because as the chat streams by, I just can't. I miss some of them, right? I tend to do things like play D&D or whatever, not D&D specifically, but RPGs at Origins, although that did not happen last year, and it is unlikely to happen this year. Because I get plenty of wargaming in normally, so I'll tend to use, convention play to play RPGs. So Heritage did a couple RPGs. The one I had was Swordbearer, which had some really interesting mechanics in it too. Will Wheaton was doing that for board games, actually. It's a different kind of production, though, because Will's thing was always very highly edited. The Critical Role stuff is not really edited much. They're pretty much, you're seeing them as they're playing, right? It's kind of, even if you're not watching it live, it's kind of like watching them live. The tabletop, the Will Wheaton tabletop was always at least when I started watching it, was always a highly edited affair where they only showed you the highlights. Vince, that's not wrong. So thank you everyone for your help this month, or this week, I should say. So, but I mean, yeah, it's the overwhelming majority of my time investment is with Wargames at this point. Now, that hasn't always been the case, right? Like most of the 90s, it was kind of even in the 90s, and in the noughts and the teens. Well, okay, so the late teens, I did very little gaming. Or the mid-teens, I did very little gaming because I was back in school. And we are still playing Forbidden Lands on Sundays, too. So there's that. So I am actually probably giving you a lowball estimate. But like a lot of my extra time that's spent here doing things like clip encounters and stuff, that's wargame time. Yes, Twilight 2000 did happen at the Armchair Dragoons Digital Convention, and that Twilight 2000 game, actually, the more I see it, the background looks a little loopy, but which is different from the classic Twilight 2000 background. The more I see of the rest of it, the more appealing it looks, actually. My feeling was it was going to be like this sort of straight, noodly storytelling type thing, and that's less true than I think fears had led me to believe. Swordbearer was a pretty neat game. I never got to play it, but it's a pretty neat game. And that's another thing that the pandemic has probably helped to promote people playing games online in general, which includes people streaming. Apparently, the Twilight 2000 game went very well, so that's cool. So, I've had, I think, every edition of Chivalry and Sorcery. I stupidly got rid of first and second edition, and I reacquired second edition I bought it at the Black and Red in Denver. They had, it was like $50, I think, but they had a fairly nice condition copy of Chivalry and Sorcery second edition, so I picked that up. Kilroy was here, mentions why not combine the two. Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's, one thing is I've always kind of wanted to do is to run a Fifth Frontier War Traveler game using the Fifth Frontier War board game as kind of the basis of what's going on at the macro level, and then in the RPG sessions we kind of zoom into that and have adventures and stuff. The Fifth Frontier War board game is not awesome as like a board game. But as like an adjunct, as an add-on to your Traveler game, it is pretty neat. I have also played Pendragon, and it was pretty cool. Well, some of those people streaming RPGs are actually, they're all sitting in the same room, and they have typically 3 cameras set up. In other cases, it is all done remotely. And, of course, you're subject to the vicissitudes of having crappy connections and all that stuff. So, all right, we're done clipping. And I have clipped 3.5 or so divisions here, which is 1.5 counter sheets, which is pretty good for a show. Starfleet battles. Yeah, I mean, you can absolutely, if you're playing any Star Trek game, you can use Starfleet battles to emulate that if you want. There's not a one-to-one correspondence between Starfleet and Star Trek, but it's close enough that your players might not notice. On the other hand, the FASA Star Trek Starship Combat was really neat and really well integrated into the RPG. So that's worth taking a look at. So the new Twilight 2000 it's the same time frame, but they've changed some of the events. And because it's a Swedish company, they felt obligated to create, in addition to the traditional Poland setting, they also added a Sweden setting as well. And they had to change the background somewhat in a not entirely sensible way to make that work. And some folks have been a little dissatisfied with that. But otherwise, the game has been very well received. It's a really nice production. The FASA Star Trek Starship miniatures were really nice. So another one of those, OSR, not a retro clone. So when we say retro clone, we mean a D&D thing, a game built on the OGL specifically to emulate some specific old version of D&D. Okay, and things like Labyrinth Lord and Swords and Wizardry are retro clones. Other things like Castles and Crusades is not a retro clone because it's not emulating a specific edition. Something like Dungeon Crawl, DCC is Dungeon Crawl Classics, and that's basically AD&D with like a lot of extra AD&D stuff. It's like AD&D but extra, right? Extra AD&D. It's almost like Hackmaster but serious. But not entirely. But there's some like legitimately neat ideas in Dungeon Crawl Classics too. I do have the core book. I've actually played it. It's pretty neat. My character, I think, died in the 0 level funnel. So the one thing you do is that you make a bunch of characters that are 0 level characters, and they're basically chodes, and you run them through what's called a funnel adventure. And if the ones that survive get to be 1st level characters, I think that's optional, but it is certainly fun. Scott Connor, I don't have an answer to that question. I like GURPS. I think GURPS is very versatile, and I was a huge supporter of it, with my dollars for many years. And I don't have to buy GURPS stuff anymore, and I'm not that interested in the fantasy trip. It is, however, it started out as like a fantasy. It started out as Melee and Wizard, which were these 2 little mini box games that were basically just standalone little board games. Melee was, gladiatorial duels between fighters, and Wizard was wizard duels. And then you could put them together, and then they added a third product called Into the Labyrinth, which kind of turned that into an RPG. It really wasn't an RPG prior to that, but it does use a hex grid for movement and combat, and GURPS, which has its fundamental origins in the fantasy trip, also uses hex grids for movement and combat. Perfidious Albion says, is the premise for New Twilight 2000 based off post-nuclear war, the former NATO? It's the same time frame. It's still the year 2000. It's still, there was a nuclear exchange a while back, and now everything's gone to crap, and you're trying to survive. It's kind of got an explicit hex crawl mechanic built into it, because Free League seems to really like that, and I don't know if that really works, but it's an attractive campaign style. Agray Day says there's a Savage Worlds. So Savage Worlds is another RPG setting, or an RPG system, which has been adapted to a lot of different settings, including Lankmar, including riffs from Palladium Books, including Flash Gordon, a whole bunch of stuff. Jason W, that's a little bit inaccurate, but it's not that inaccurate. It is. That's why I said it's like AD&D, but more. So, Top Secret, I think is so of TSR's other RPGs, other than D&D. I think the ones that hold up really well are Marvel Superheroes, Top Secret, and Gangbusters. Gangbusters being the underappreciated one. Everybody has a lot of love for their Marvel Superheroes game now, and I didn't like it at the time. In retrospect, that was dumb. It was a very innovative system, incredibly influential. I mean, so, and I'm a little unclear on what exactly they did with Hackmaster 2. I mean, it was kind of done as a joke, and then it was not a joke anymore, and it was a serious game now. I'm a little confused. I think there was a branding fault there. Mike Anthony mentions that Dark City Games has been publishing Fantasy Trip compatible adventures. Yeah, that's true. That would be great, actually. I'd love to see. They're doing really good support for the Fantasy Trip. And my disinterest in the Fantasy Trip should not be taken as you shouldn't be interested in the Fantasy Trip. It is a huge, you can kind of get into it to whatever extent you want. You can either buy the tiny thing and just do that, and that's like $10, or you can buy the $200 coffin-sized box of stuff. Doug says he would categorize Gunslinger as an RPG as well. If you say that Boot Hill was an RPG, then I agree with you. I, however, don't think that Boot Hill was much of an RPG, and therefore, while I'm not arguing with you that Gunslinger has RPG elements, it's more of a board game with RPG elements, where Boot Hill is more of a miniatures game with RPG elements that thinks it is a role-playing game. Let me put it that way. Torg, hated it. Absolutely hated it. The setting's actually pretty neat, but the mechanics are not great. I think there's a new version of Torg, and I think there was a Savage Worlds version of Torg too, which actually may have addressed my issues with the system. We're talking about the wargaming. Now we're into the wargaming end of RPGs, at least. I don't think I ever owned Star Frontiers. I might be wrong about that. I don't remember ever owning Star Frontiers. I did own Gamma World, a couple of editions of Gamma World. I think I owned every other RPG that TSR did, including their version of Dragon Quest, SPI's Dragon Quest. They did one printing of it. They took out the demons and devils because, TSR, but of the representative of the era, and they never did anything with it. They published one adventure that was like a hybrid where you could use it with either D&D or Dragon Quest, and it never went any farther than that. My taste. So another thing that happened, and we've got another half an hour here pretty much. The Pace Setter RPGs. I do remember Pace Setter, and Time Master was actually really neat and underrated. Another thing that happened was people started talking about RPGs online, and in some cases they got super navel-gazing about it, and started creating a lot of this sort of theoretical underpinning framework of RPGs. Somebody, and I didn't look this up. I didn't have time to look this up before the stream, but somebody came up with an idea called the GNS idea, okay? And that was basically that there's like three axes of RPGs. There's gamist RPGs, which is all about you're playing a game. There's narrativist RPGs, which is all about you're telling a story. And there's simulationist RPGs, which is all about you're simulating things. And then a lot of the same people who previously spent years talking about this had then later decided that simulation was not real and nobody actually played RPGs for that reason. And I was like, I play RPGs for that reason, and felt left out. But out of that community, we got what's now called the indie RPG scene, which is a lot of experimental. It's like the prog. In a lot of ways, it's the prog rock of RPGs, right? It's a lot of experimental stuff that in some cases works in a pretty traditional way, and in other cases it's really not suitable for like traditional campaign type formats, but certainly good for one shots. There's a whole world of these things, to the point where there's a couple of booths at Origins, Indie Press Revolution, that pretty much just carry those. A lot of the more recent designs in the field have reflected some of the ideas of that indie RPG scene, some of that highly narrativist RPG approach. And I like to experiment with that stuff. I like to sit with the games on demand folks that play a lot of indie stuff and try different things. But I'll, in a lot of cases, my tastes are very old school and pedestrian, and I want to play older style stuff. In some cases, older style stuff that looks a lot like D&D, and that's why I like something like Rollmaster, because you can run Rollmaster kind of like you run D&D. So that's true, Drew. That is true. No Hawkwind here. Hawkwind not allowed. Sword and Sorcery. SPI's Swords and Sorcery. Interesting looking game. I never owned that, but it was explicitly an attempt to hybridize RPGs and wargames. And it's full of puns. Agri Day, isn't there a solo Napoleon RPG wargame where you play a soldier during the war? I think that what you are talking about is the card game from Clash of Arms. Medal of Honor, is that what it's called? That's kind of, I think that's the thing you're talking about. Now, Ted Racer is also doing I, Napoleon from GMT, which he describes as a role-playing game. I'm not sure he's right. Freedom of the Galaxy also has some RPG elements to it, too, and that's a favorite game of mine, actually. I played Dogs in the Vineyard, actually, with actual Mormons, no less. So, or ex-Mormons, at least. I've been talking so hard, I've hardly drank any scotch, actually. But I'm very much enjoying the scotch I'm drinking. So, I mean, all of this is, I guess, just sort of to give you some context about where I'm coming from on this. I'm old enough to say, hey, and it Medal of Honor, that's the one I'm thinking of. To say, hey, there's room for everybody, right? There's if you have a different way of playing or different preferences, that's cool. But I've got my preferences, and they tend to be on the old school side. They tend to be on the traditionalist side. Legion of Honor, yeah, okay, that's the one I'm talking about. I mean, some of those Avalon Hill, I mean, I don't know. So, I mean, part of what motivated the question is, what do we mean by old school? And for so many of us, including me, what I mean by old school is motivated by my formative experiences back in the 70s. Really very late 70s, maybe. But really in the early 80s, which is why, to me, old school D&D that looks back to white box D&D feels terrible. It doesn't feel right to me. It's not the old school experience that I had. Moldvay Basic was the old school experience, and AD&D First Edition. Those were the old school experiences that I had. And the same thing applies to wargaming, right? If you started playing wargaming in the late 60s and you grew up playing Bulge 65 and Africa Corps, then that's your old school, right? That's the point. Dawn Patrol was marketed as an RPG. It's not really it's another one of those, it's not really an RPG. It's got some RPG elements to it. By the way, how does the lighting look? Because I've got some extra lighting in the room tonight. Paranoia. Apparently there's a Paranoia video game coming. I might buy that. It's not necessarily that it's about nostalgia. It's about your history, though, right? Some people don't, they've moved on from the history. Some people have played Hex Encounter and don't want to play Hex Encounter anymore. I know people like that, and so do you. So, Sniper. Yeah, Sniper had some RPG elements. So everything's bouncing off the ceiling or the wall in front of me here. And in fact, if I hold my hands up, you can see there's a lot of light bouncing off my hands because that's where the light is coming from. But it's all above my head, so it should be pretty good for this. Okay, let's circle back to Wargaming here, but I also want to talk about upcoming videos and channel stuff. So there might be a Traveler Tuesday video tomorrow if I can get it done tonight. There will be a Thursday. I will also squeeze out another unboxing or two if I can. But the feature unboxing on Thursday will be Hollow Legions, which showed up a couple days ago. And which is a very impressive, large package. More counter sheets for ASL that I don't know how to organize. I still have my notes still say Wednesday, but the stream with Dan is on Tuesday. That's tomorrow night at 7:30. The big news is I am thinking of adding another stream, which will be less wargame oriented and might be RPG and or video game oriented, and more likely both. It's very unlikely to be like a live or RPG live play. I'm just not set up to do that right now. And it may not be weekly. It may be once a month or every 2 weeks or something like that. But let me know your thoughts about if I added another stream, and I would be shooting for a 2 to 3 hour stream at some point, probably on a week in the evening. But it also might be a late night stream. I might start it at like 11 p.m. so that I can, our European folks can stop complaining to me that they can't catch the stream live. So, I'm hoping that the light, if it's a little too bright right now, unless I hold my hands up here, which is expected to be too bright, I'm hoping that the new webcam will help to mitigate that. Jeff Beeler says that the old school Wargaming is the old Avalon Hill games that all use the same CRT. Yeah, he's not wrong. Steel Panthers. Yeah, I played Steel Panthers. It was pretty good, as I recall. When I'm there, I mean, let's be honest. Any additional stream is probably going to be me talking for a couple hours. So what we might do is like an RPG prep stream or something like that. It might be RPG just bullshitting. That's possible. Ardwulf After Hours was the perspective, or Ardwulf After Dark. Those were titles that are in the neighborhood of what I was considering. So, yeah, Quinto stuff. If you started wargaming in the 80s, I mean, is like 3W your old school, right? I'm really curious. Or you Quinto, for that matter. I know for a lot of people, GDW is their old school. A surprising number of people. But maybe that, there's a selection bias in there. That's just a lot of people that I happen to know. So there's that. There's some strange noises coming from outside. John Longshore has just deleted Steel Panthers. It's really hard to go back to those old ugly video games, I can tell you that. I do not have a time frame in mind for the new stream, by the way. I just would like to add one, and I've wanted to add one for a while, and I figured I would mention it so that maybe we could get some feedback. Cry Havoc. I remember seeing that on old game store shelves back in the day, too. That is a miniature skirmish game, as I recall, though. Interesting packaging. I think those were UK games, I think. But they made it over here. I think there's a lot, Carl, I think there's a lot of people who were, it's kind of like a Marvel DC thing, where if you read comics during a certain period, You either read Marvel or you read DC, and relatively few people read both. And I think Avalon Hill and SPI was a little bit of that too. You were either Avalon Hill or SPI and not both. However, when I got into Wargames, SPI was really about to die in 1981. So, while certainly their legacy endured even for me, I moved on mostly to Avalon Hill stuff. And some GDW. There's like some kind of weird moaning coming from outside. I doubt the mic is picking it up. Tactics 2 is, I mean, if that was your first war game, then congratulations. But I do not believe that Tactics 2, and indeed a lot of the really old Avalon Hill games are really worthwhile anymore. Speaking of which, Charles Roberts' daughter just showed up in the Avalon Hill group on Facebook. So that's an interesting development. Fire and Movement. I really miss Fire and Movement and Moves magazine, actually. I really would like to see a lot of the place of that sort of forum function of a general wargaming magazines that weren't distracted by having games in them have been taken by forums and blogs and YouTube channels and all that stuff. So really it's my fault that those magazines are dead now. There is War Diary, though, which I will be bringing you a video on relatively soon, which is a wargaming magazine that does not have a game in every issue. So we've got time yet. So that's the news. So I'll remind folks that yes, you may if you like these videos, please do like the video. Please do subscribe to the channel, and please do hit the little bell icon to get notified when new content comes out. And if you want to do more to support Ardwulf's Lair, there's the stickers and stuff like that you can do in the chats, which I probably should have turned on many months ago. And there's also the Patreon and the merch store and all that stuff. So I have ordered shirts. I will have a couple of shirts at Winterfest. I will not have a lot of shirts at Winterfest. So another thing that I mean, do we consider BattleTech? Because I played BattleTech around the early 80s too, or maybe it was mid 80s. Right, the first edition of it when it came out. Wargamers Digest. Is that not a miniatures magazine, or am I nuts? Stigler, I think you're right about that. But I don't know if that's a phenomenon unique to Fire and Movement either. There's been a very shabby history of RPG criticism in the history of this hobby, and truthfully, the person who was best at it was Richard Berg, I think. Yeah, I was not like a huge fan of BattleTech, but I do feel like it's a legit war game. I mean, it's on a hex grid and everything, right? And even if the pieces were not counters, they were at least made of cardboard originally. You could eventually get miniatures for them, but and of course BattleTech endures as a computer game as well, and you could still there's people still doing the board game too. So Crimson Skies, another one from FASA back in the day. The folks from FASA are pretty much the folks that ended up at WizKids. So FASA never really went away. I mean, FASA went away, but all their properties hung around. Other than the licensed things like their Star Trek RPG, which was underrated, actually. They did an early Doctor Who RPG as well, for that matter. See, when I bought it, Hissy Cat Studio, there were no miniatures available yet. It was just cardboard stand-ups. Jeff Beeler says that Wargamer Digest ran a campaign where the Germans fought the Soviets on the Peninsula campaign maps from the U.S. Civil War. That's pretty bananas, I gotta tell you. William Aaron's, well, you're no fun. No, that's true. But if I start a stream at 2 a.m., it's gonna be like, yeah, I'm going to bed, guys. Everybody have a good night. So that would mean being no fun. This is the optimal time for me to have a stream because I'm at my most alert for the day. My wife is downstairs streaming, by the way, so which I think is why I'm not going to try streaming in 4K on our current connection. The new camera will support 4K, and it would look great, but you're just looking at my ugly mug, and I don't think every pore in my face in 4K is really something that anybody needs to see. So we're going to stick with, for streaming purposes, we're going to stick with 1080, but I will plan to leverage the 4K capabilities of the cameras elsewhere, which is something that I've been trying to do. The phone will actually take 4K videos, but then it will. I can only do like 8 minutes at a time, and it's a pain in the ass. Yes, most of the art from the early BattleTech stuff came from Japanese anime that they got loose understanding of copyright law, presumably. Scott, I don't think that is a feasible... You can do a website that does that, I think. But I don't think you can do a print magazine that does that anymore. Can anybody name a print magazine covering RPGs now? That's like being printed now. I can't. So there's been some attempts, but can't think of any. On the other hand, there's tons of electronic things, right? I looked at the Traveler... Freelance Traveler is like a Traveler like bi-monthly magazine that has been published since like 2009 or something like that. Like literally he skipped like one issue. Every other month you get like 50 pages of cool Traveler stuff. And it's a great effort. It's a wonderful resource. And if you printed it, he'd have been out of business years ago. My wife is she streaming herself right now, or is she just recording? She's just recording. So her hold on, I'll give you. So if you folks could all go and subscribe to her YouTube channel, that would be great. She does video game stuff, and it's not wargaming video game stuff. She likes buildy video games. So if you don't want that in your feed, don't subscribe, because you'll get a lot of it if you do subscribe. But if she jumps, like I'll put it in this chat as soon as I find one of her videos. So if you wouldn't mind, you can go ahead and go subscribe over there. Factory Town is what she's playing right now. It's adorable, but I'm just not. I can't. She can't get into Wargames, and I can't get rid of that. Open question: will Ty Bomba grind Paper Wars into the ground? Actually, I feel like Ty's doing a pretty good job so far with Paper Wars, and I'd rather Ty do that than. Let me be super delicate about this. I don't like Ty Bomba's designs. I'm not going to say he's never done a good design. I will say that a lot of his designs simply do not interest me. Some of those that do have had some really serious problems. If Ty's true vocation is running the magazine and being an editor, rather than designing Wargames, then I am all for Ty running Paper Wars. So that is a thing that I fully support. And, I'm paying attention to what he says on Facebook. So I hope that he does well, and he seems to be doing okay as the person in charge of Paper Wars. That's Mike. I don't know how I feel about that. And maybe that's why they gave him the job, because he's super, super prolific. But that's, that brings its own challenges, right? It's if you rush stuff out. Now, some of his older designs for Command, I think, were actually probably better, but I think a lot of his recent stuff has been unappealing to me. So, oh, look at that. Yeah. Thanks, guys. That's going great. So, fantastic. Thank you so much for helping her out like that. She doesn't have a lot of subscribers. She's on Twitch too, but she hasn't streamed very much on Twitch. Kilroy was here, has put it in the perfect way. So, John Longshorts, buy for the game, stay for the haircut. He does have an interesting haircut. But I'm not going to criticize. I mean, you know, look at this beard, man. This is the beard of a 14-year-old terrorist. So, when am I going to make fun of somebody else's haircut for? That'd be crazy. Vince says that he did get to try out those games, those new modern war games, and he did not like them. So, I glanced at them and they looked unappealing to me. But I'm not super into that topic, right? And I've talked about this. I'm like massively overexposed and overinvested in that topic. So I don't need more Cold War gone hot stuff. So, kill shot of the night. Yeah, absolutely. So we got just a couple more minutes. So did I miss anything off the outline? I put the outline together right before the show, so it's pretty half-assed. I don't think so. Looking forward. So Winterfest at this point is 1, 2, 3 weeks away. So not a lot of time. We will be playing. So here's what I know is happening. I know there's a huge Ostfront game, which is the entire East Front starting in 43. I don't know how far they'll get. There's an additional Forgotten Battles game. There's at least one and maybe as many as 2 games of The Greatest Day, Gold, Juno, and Sword. There's going to be another OCS game, which looks like it's going to be Beyond the Rhine. There's going to be a Der Weltkrieg 1915 game. Don't know how much of the 1915 war that's going to cover. And that's what we're aware of at this time. So, I mean, the Central Front games were, I think, are still really well regarded, right? And that's why people wanted to see them redone, but for some reason, Decision didn't really want to do that. They wanted to, like, put a new spin on them and not... At some point, we're going to have to tackle this topic, right, of the choices that publishers make when they decide they're going to revisit an older game, right? And it's not just Decision, right? So we have GMT that's redoing Vietnam 1965 to 75, and they made a decision to say, we're not going to redesign this game. We're going to basically fix the graphics. We're going to tweak 1 or 2 really small things, and we're going to publish it as it was published in 1980, whatever. There are some issues with that game, right? People, I have not discovered them through play, but I have talked to people who have played it a lot, and there are some issues with that game that really should be addressed. GMT made the decision to not do that. And is that the wrong decision? I don't know that it is, but it's the publisher making a decision about, how they're going to proceed with handling this old title that people remember very fondly, an old school title, if you wish. And Decision has consistently made decisions that maybe consistently is I think a fair word to use. Not 100% of the time, but they have sometimes made some questionable decisions when the time came to republish SPI classics in one form or another. Either completely redesigning them but using the old titles, which gives people a butthurt feeling about it, right? Even if I like the redesigns, it's still going to disappoint somebody that was expecting a new Atlantic Wall, and what they got is this completely different game. Or But they have, in some cases, just done exactly that. Just brought the old game back. Napoleon's Last Battles. It's just the old game with a couple extra options in it and nicer graphics. That's it. Battle for Germany, same thing. World War I, same thing. A number of other, and in fact, Highway to the Reich is another one. They've made relatively few changes to that, to the point where it inherits some of the problems of the original game. So the Undaunted series is supposed to be really good. I haven't actually played any of them, but I appreciate what David's trying to do with those. I have a relatively high opinion of David's ability to bring a crossover audience into wargaming. On the other hand, I saw it, somebody said, and maybe we'll circle back to this in a later show. Somebody said, wargaming really needs to have simpler games people can get into. Are you unaware of all the simple introductory war games that are out there now? Are like Undaunted, like, you know, all the other things like that. Those games exist already. We do not need particularly to more of them necessarily. I mean, that's not to say any particular designer who's working on something shouldn't do it, but it's not like the games don't exist in that space right now. There's plenty of introductory war games. It's counterproductive to then for us to argue about whether they're war games or not. But that is a question that we are probably not going to tackle here tonight. Okay, so I mean, they could do the other 5 games that I think people wanted to see, right? In Central Front, if they wanted to, just use the same system. Why not? It's a good system. I don't know if I have an opinion on Battles for the Ardennes. I did buy the Bastogne game, the standalone game in the quad, and it's a completely different game than the original SPI game. I don't know about the ones in the actual quad. I thought those were pretty much the same game, but I could be wrong. That's not one that I've looked at. So, all right, we're getting super snotty. I'm going to go take some Flonase, so I would like to thank everybody for stopping by. What number did we top out at tonight? Let's find out. Looks like about 127, which is a great number. 128, great number. So we'll be back to Wargames, and more Wargames next week, I think. And that's, you know, me talking about RPGs for an hour and a half probably did cause some people to doze off. So there's that. So we'll pick another wargame topic. Don't forget, we're on No Enemies Here's channel tomorrow at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So tune in for Dan on that. I will see you all, and tune in for the rest of the videos. Don't forget to support the channel at your continued viewership and participation in the community here is much appreciated. A whole bunch of cool stuff is on the